Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. We have back with us today meteorologist Greg Soulje, and you might recognize Greg from being on Feedstuffs 365 in the past with us. We do a monthly segment with him, or perhaps you've caught his weather forecasts on This Week in Agribusiness on RFD TV and a number of other stations across the nation. So, welcome back, Greg. Great to have you with us again.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Always enjoy getting together with you guys here and talking weather on what's been really a pretty remarkable spell of weather this past winter time season, more or less like early spring many a time. But yeah, nice to be with you. And we'll take a look at things down the line here for the coming days, weeks, and months and get everyone lined up from a planning or livestock standpoint across the heartland of the United States.
Very good. And before we begin our conversation, let's invite anyone joining us to post any questions they might have there in the chat. Or if you're joining us through social media, you can put those right there in your social media channels, and we will get to those as we progress here through our discussion. So like you mentioned, Greg, oh my gosh, this last month I'm sorry, you've spoiled us because I went for a walk last night and it was 70 degrees at till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're looking at 65, I think it is here today in Chicago. So
Yep.
so I know you told us last month that
Yes.
spring is not here yet, but
Right.
I might take issue with you on that. But tell us what are we expecting here? Is spring here, or is there still some more winter ahead?
I'll wait for your terse text to probably over the weekend or early next week when there'll be snow in the air in our particular part of the Midwest. So we're not done with winter time. This is sort of a fall spring, but in any event, yeah, things are pretty active in the short term of it all. But let's go ahead and take a look at things here. We put some weather maps and charts together for you. Let's go ahead and first take a look at how really El Nino is continuing to drive this whole weather pattern, whether it has to do with temperatures in the open Pacific, dryness and drought issues, which have been really eradicated over some sections of the country. Others, it's still ongoing. So just a quick little snapshot here of waters across the central Pacific, that horizontal line right at 0 degrees there. That is the equator. Here's the western sections of South America, Central America, and up towards Old Mexico. And you get out towards Australia here and Indonesia. So right along this corridor, this is as of late January, water temperatures running about 2 to 3 degrees above average. You think, big deal. Well, look how expansive water is across the globe. 75% of the planet is made up of water, and most weather systems, as they apply to North America, originate from the west, or at least out across the Pacific, or obviously sections of Canada. So El Nino is still alive and kicking, but in its beginning to fade and dying phases. Was hoping that was able to get this graphic to have a little motion to it, but you see some cooling off the Chilean coast down here. This is a drop off in temperatures by a couple of degrees centigrade. The corridor of above average warmth here, this is as of late December, is beginning to shrink. So overall, we do foresee and continue to see the slow winding down of El Nino, and there are some growing indications as well of overall a weather pattern and picture that will move to a neutral state and then in what we call into a La Nina setup. So if you obviously warm waters across the Pacific, you move them to a neutral state. That's a neutral atmosphere, as we call it, or average water temperatures in the Pacific. You go with the other direction, you cool them off. Well, that's a La Nina setup. And so we see that whole spectrum really of water temperatures in the Pacific and this oscillating effect back and forth out over the next probably 6 to 10 months. So we have at least a pretty firm grip, at least our thinking around here, of how springtime plays out. Some somewhat muddled thoughts, but a general idea of how summer goes, and we'll see what transpires here thereafter. This is the December 5th, the start of meteorological winter drought monitor map. And yeah, problems still lurking. There was little, if any, significant fast harvest season, mind you, and maybe not so great yields across the western corn belt. But here is the ongoing dryness and drought over the western corn belt back into the north end of winter wheat. Problems in the southwest. This was just a dire setup. So much for a tropical weather season. Nothing making landfall across the Delta region, lower Mississippi Valley, and into the Tennessee Valley. But then let's fast forward to the drought monitor from last week. Boy, big improvements in some areas of the plains, Kansas in particular, some sections west of about Lincoln and Norfolk of Nebraska that has seen a return to more average, typical, normal soil moisture levels. And it is pretty amazing that we saw this improvement not only here, parts of the central corn belt from an improvement standpoint, but down through the lower Mississippi Valley Delta region. When you normally don't see that, even in the midst of winter and early springtime. So, and again, some of those rains were certainly of a flooding variety out of Tennessee and the lower Mississippi Valley region. Problems, again, this area through New Mexico, West Texas, you bring those winds off the southern Rockies, you already have desert air and heat. You get the wind to crank on up, the nose of the jet stream, which has been running out of the Pacific, kind of dropping into the southern plains and lifting north and northeast. No wonder we've had the fires down there on that Canadian area, 1.1 billion acres, I believe. And it's still kind of a tinderbox of problems there. But the Western Corn Belt, it's Iowa. And note the worst thing, really, would you believe, up across the northern plains, upper Midwest, northern Great Lakes region. You think a bunch of snow. You think you'd get some absorption and percolation in there? Nope. So this is a problem area that's going to have to be watched. They will probably be ahead of the game with anyone with planting in the Red River Valley of the North. That usual flood season is not going to happen this winter season. And the northern Corn Belt locales as well. So just from an equal opportunity perspective, here's what the feds were thinking. They put this out every month, and then there's a seasonal aspect as well. This was put out late February for this month, and some modest improvement continues to play out over the southwestern Corn Belt. There is no anticipated improvement by their thinking over the southwest. We would tend to occur, at least agree with that, in a recurring situation where this is not going to show any significant improvement. We see on our maps and charts a window later this springtime with the upper configuration maybe getting some moisture going, but in pockets we continue to see the last of any lingering dryness and drought over the southwestern Corn Belt and down through Dixie as well. The outlook as it applies to the next 90 days. This came out again end of February through the end of May, the conclusion of meteorological spring. Again, further improvement. We'll see what happens in the shorter range and the medium range. And from our thinking as well, we do expect probably some weather systems to improve the drought pattern without any frost or freeze in the ground. This may come down in the form of snow, but you wanted moisture, so we likely will see that. There's agreement here with us in the weather office over the Western Corn Belt. This looks to be a pretty solid situation as well, and into the Delta region as well. Now, into the Big Sky country, the spring grain areas of southern Canada, North Dakota, Bismarck, Mandan, east of the Red River, and through northern Wisconsin. We may be out there early, but you may be kicking the dust and dirt around wondering when this stuff is going to germinate. So there may be an early start to the season here, but again, you got to do the usual trade-off with fighting frost and freeze. So Sarah, that's pretty much the story as it applies to El Nino and dryness and drought. Incredible and remarkable that we're able to put improvement to some of these areas of the country, particularly the Midwest, in the midst of wintertime, when it ought to be locked down, frozen, solid. We're going to probably set records, and I think the Climate Prediction Center is still putting the data points together along with the Illinois Water Survey of probably one of the warmest, or the top 5 warmest, or the top 10 warmest in probably virtually all northern and central plains and Corn Belt locations for the wintertime season. Whether it's temperature, that'll be the primary story. Heavy rain may be above average, but a phenomenally low and almost drought-ridden snow year, and that especially applying to the northern plains, Minnesota, and up through northern and central sections of Wisconsin.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see, and just to actually to know that precipitation is actually going in the ground in a lot of cases, as opposed to usually it's frozen ground and it's just running off, and we're getting that in there. So, but as you indicate, lots of trade-offs. Is it too dry to plant, or are you what is your risk there? So lots to watch and lots to pay attention to as we move into spring. It sounds like.
Yeah, there's a phrase that the gentleman I work for kind of cut my teeth in the weather business, Earl Finkel. And when you would get into these weather patterns, there's a term he would use, and it still applies, and you got to kind of sit back and think about it. But the term abnormal weather gets you abnormal weather. Just think about that. They wake you up about 2 a.m. You say, "Oh, I know what Greg's talking about." So
now I get it.
So that's pretty much the story that we have here at the conclusion of winter and into springtime around here, still driven by El Nino. So on to the other maps and charts here, let's kind of lay the groundwork, which is we typically like to do. We do this at presentations and in person. Yeah, I just don't think you can just pick up and let's just start in July and talk about the weather pattern going forward. I think you need building blocks. There's meteorology involved. That's maybe an old school version of it, of how you do forecasting, but that's just the way we do it around here. Here are these spaghetti lines, upper air charts, and you can see kind of two ribbons of wind kind of bunched together, those lines out of the Canadian prairie through the Corn Belt, that buckling, that U-shaped configuration. And so you think you're into springtime at 16, 70 degree weather here. Not quite astronomical spring. That begins, I believe, on the 19th at 10:06 of the evening Central Time. But in any event, there's cold air on the move, and you will be just probably cursing out the weather guy, because we'd be surprised that we do get into some snow as far south as maybe the I-70 corridor, parts of the western Corn Belt. Now, nothing big, obviously. Prior to that, we will likely see this system. And this is the feature we've just mentioned, and there's another one later into the month of April that gets, as we say, gets cut off from the main circulation. So there's some optimism. There may be some moisture in the southwestern states, but also breeds severe weather. This is the panel that would take us, this last panel here, to the 20, at least running through the end of this date is incorrect. This actually should be the end of March. So that said, and here is the weather systems then through March. That upper chart, by the way, I will go back to that. So this date up here is incorrect. This will take you to the about the 20th of March. So we do anticipate, again, colder air on the move, moisture in the transition, and some moisture in the southwestern part of the country, as well as some of the drier reaches of the western Corn Belt and back into the plains. And you can see a couple of these weather systems spun up pretty good out of southern Canada, making its way through the northern Great Lakes region, the St. Lawrence River Valley. And you can see 1, 2, 3 cold fronts making their way down across the country. By the time we get to the last panel here, this would be the 20th of March. And you begin to see some semblance of cold air, as we can see it here on the maps and charts, through the Canadian prairie. And overall, the weather pattern that forgot to turn that off. Sorry about that. And in any event, the cold air, which is through the Canadian prairie, the usual south winds out of the plains with spring warmth, and the end result, we do transpire and transition into a active weather pattern, much like this. And this is a pretty good example of it over the next 5 to 7 days. Moisture, as mentioned, in the southwest, not enough to ease the drought, something into West Texas, but there'll be wind involved. And in this corridor over Oklahoma, eastern Texas, down through the Delta region, the likelihood of significant moisture, 1, 2, maybe 3, 4 inches, and probably fraught with severe weather in the short term. The next couple of days, we anticipate probably several rounds of severe weather. It is March. We're getting into April here soon, and that is the severe weather season for the southern plains, the southern states, and a migration northward. And note the moisture too out of Iowa, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin. So everyone gets a fair shake at it. There will be some accumulating snow, probably from Des Moines on westward, and again through the Dakotas, the northerns and central areas of Minnesota. Not much to speak of, so very little significant improvement there. Back to the snow cover issues and the lack thereof. This was the panel back in the 16th of January. We had snow all the way down to Dallas-Fort Worth, Shreveport, Louisiana, parts of the northwestern Delta region. Here we are, not unusual or surprising for this point in very late wintertime, early springtime, but a major erosion. And we haven't had really anything of significant snow cover wise since really late January, early February. So a lot of that moisture has already been percolated into the ground. A lot of that moisture has been swept up by fairly fast and high evaporation for wintertime, with these winds that have been in the 30 to 40 mile per hour range. And then you put these temperatures in the 50s, 60s, record-setting 70s. I believe a couple of days ago, I believe it was Sioux Falls, Sioux City, that had 80, 70 up at Fargo. So that's just, pardon me, phenomenal temperatures for the time of year. Onto the snow cover and snowpack, basically by measurement here. This was the panel as of the 16th of January. And the last time we'd had anything of significance on the ground, more than 4 inches on the ground, through northern Illinois, eastern Iowa, corridor of snow all the way down through Dixie. We talked about that when we last met in February, and significant snows across the northern and central Rockies, basically the Sierra. And at this point, we had something in the Cascades, but that has since backed off, and really has backed off. As of the 13th of March, That's 12.4% of the country covered in snow. And it is only and really confined to two areas, northern New England, parts of Colorado, areas around Yellowstone and back up across the Bitterroot chain. And then you get into the Pacific Northwest and Cascades, and the majority of that 12.4%, roughly 80 to 85%, is in the Sierra range. And the water equivalency, every year we talk about it, and they need it, is the runoff supply that helps to feed reservoirs going into the Sacramento Valley. This year, and I believe this is only the second time since 2015 that they put together, at least California, the Sierra Ranges, back-to-back normal or above moisture seasons in that particular part of the country. I think that information is from the California Department of Natural Resources. So good news out there. It did come at a price with some severe weather and flooding earlier on this winter season. So back onto these squiggly lines here, and all you really need to pick up here over the next 6 to 10 days to the 22nd of March are these green lines. The dashed reds really just showing there's a warmth up aloft into Canada, or I should say Alaska and northwestern reaches of Canada. When that happens, that buckles the jet stream out and southward. And again, pretty good correlation that we will get into some colder, at least initially more seasonal air, but there may be a little more of a mid or late winter bite for parts of the northern plains and Corn Belt locales for a time early next week. That's the outlook through the 22nd, through the 26th. We know, again, here's that at least ridging across the northern Pacific, Gulf of Alaska, downstream, as we call it, some blue dashed lines. So temperatures a little colder at the surface and more so up a lot, but it's more or less a west to east, what we call a kind of a flat zone, zonal flow out of California into the eastern states. But when you get these ribbons of cold air in these northern jet stream configurations along with disturbances that run west to east, the two combine, it's like trying to make some oil and water together. And that's how you come up with these spring storms and precipitation outbreaks. So a little bit optimistic there. If you wanted to just buy in the old 6 to 10 day, a lot of this gets kicked around on social media, just kind of a rip and read thing. This is what the Feds think, and there should be no big surprises here that temperatures are going to return to more seasonal levels, if not a few degrees below. If you were to pick places like Des Moines or Chicago or Fort Wayne or Columbus or maybe Omaha, that's basically a range from 30s over the eastern Corn Belt to readings into the 50s in the western Corn Belt. So that's a few degrees above average west of the Missouri and below average more or less like maybe mid to late February, early March into the eastern Corn Belt locales. Just moving ahead here for precipitation, back to a little bit of a drier spell. Nothing to write home about for the Ohio Valley. Here's the new news that we talked about over the Southwest. This is late in arriving, but some good news there up through Big Sky Country. You want to fast forward out the next 8 to 14 days. Expectations of the cold abating, seasonal temperatures across a good part of the heartland. And moisture, though, we talked about that northern branch varying up with the more west to east oriented southern branch or jet stream pattern out of California. And so it comes up to be kind of a, mishmash. It's a fairly benign looking outlook, but would agree that, the western states, the southeastern part of the country, and I think with time we'll begin to see that transpire east across sections of the plains and Corn Belt. So, Sarah, that's kind of the thinking around here, taking us through just about the end part of March. And are you ready for the spring outlook? We've updated it, and a couple of thoughts on summertime here as it applies to the country. Let me know when you're ready to go.
Yeah, let's do that. I mean, this is the old meteorologist term, right? March in like a lamb, out like a lion. I think we're seeing a little bit of that here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a little bit late in arriving, but these transition months here, particularly with a weather pattern that's either an El Nino driven or a La Nina driven, they tend to be a little more rambunctious. But we think there's optimism here. Again, was it a speaking engagement in Champaign a few weeks ago, and someone had asked, "Well, Greg, what's your confidence level?" I wouldn't put this on TV or radio or these broadcasts here. If I wasn't confident in it, I don't really understand why he even asked that, but the guy was sincere about it. And then asked, what do you think? Out there, not out there, delays, what have you? I says, well, you'll probably be out there more often than not. So I think despite moisture coming our way, this is not the way the whole spring season goes. And it is, again, a benefit to folks that need a little more moisture over the Corn Belt locale. So here we go. We'll take a look at the spring outlook now. And here we go through the remainder of March. Yeah, look at a little ominous there with the last of the warmth around here. Again, I'm telling people on the radio, so you guys think it's springtime, just enjoy it while you may. Maybe something that is used on the ag sector with livestock. Finkel used it. The other boot and or hoof, I think, is going to drop. And it will be dropping here as we head through the mid to late stretches of March. There is some tendency of some recurring cold air. Again, this is a fall spring, but if we made it through wintertime like this, more power to outdoor operations, I suspect. Here's this U-shaped buckle across the middle part of the country, leftover warmth east of the Ohio Valley, and you get that set up. And it usually is a pretty active weather pattern with the jet, again, kind of far south for the time of year. So there's opportunities for maybe the ski operations in the western states. I'm not exactly sure where we're at with calving and lambing operations. I think we were about 20, 25, 30% complete, but that was a couple of weeks ago. So got to keep an eye on this across Big Sky, the Dakotas, some of the main livestock areas there. And of course, on the southern plains, where we do anticipate some additional moisture for some of those livestock areas, the south end of winter wheat, but again, coming at a price. And it's not unusual for March to ramp up the severe weather season. And I think we have 2, maybe 3 weather systems in this time frame to stay heads up for. But again, nothing unusual, nothing off the charts, nothing is going to be of a historic nature. It's par for the course, as you'd expect. Springtime weather with, again, semblance of El Nino still into play and trying to begin a winding down process. And that typically, usually El Nino is a little more dominant and noticeable in the wintertime, and it becomes more muted as you get into spring. And a weakening El Nino is even more muted. So you tend to rely on more or less the traditional approaches to forecasting and thinking El Nino is not really going to have an influence and it's on the wane to begin with. And it's a progressive weather pattern. Things are moving, so we anticipate maybe a quick shot of some cold air to the eastern Corn Belt. That jet stream, those green-blue arrows are pushed way up into the southern reaches of Canada. The far northwestern and northern parts of the country will dip southward into the mid-Atlantic region, but under that, as we call the ridge, the warm, hot ridge for relative to summertime, well, its early stages will begin to form up across sections of the western United States and into the Plain States areas. So that takes us here into the early to mid stretches of April. So we anticipate a nice recovery on soil temperatures. If you've got stuff in the ground early on in these windows of opportunity, but there's not a lot coming, there ought to be some respectable germination. We'll keep an eye on those winter wheat fields, which should be hopping pretty good. And except for that cold that we had here in late March, and I don't think there's a lot outbreak in dormancy. I think there's more of a frost concern in the short term in the southeastern states. I think any open and exposed fields or winter wheat ought to be in relatively good shape. Here is this window of opportunity. While there's some indications of the southwestern and southern sections of the country getting into significant moisture, including the Cotton Belt, a little bit into the Pacific Northwest, a window of opportunity. This is good news for a good part of the central and southern Corn Belt, thinking we'll have some semblance of recharge of the plains. We can deal with that. There may be some lingering dryness and drought-related issues, but a general improvement. We should have all eradicated the drought in the southeast and probably potential for some fieldwork delays from time to time more in the southern states. And then I wouldn't be surprised if folks are going at it with maybe some corn planting a little earlier than usual, even into the northern parts of the Corn Belt and into the Great Lakes region. So there is a window of opportunity there. We go into the late week to 10 days of April and early to mid-May. That upper pattern, jet stream pattern, the green arrows, blue-green arrows are more west to east oriented. That lobe of cold air retreats northward, and usually without, at least highs and cold air masses tend to want to follow cold waters of the Great Lakes region, and B, snow cover, neither of which are going to be dominant. So we think the cold air and frost and freeze concerns should be generally lacking. Cold soils should be lacking this year, seasonal, if you will, even keeled, if you will. No big spikes, no big drop-offs. So far to late April, early to mid-May, I think we're in a good shape here, not only from a planning standpoint across the Corn Belt, manageable with livestock operations, with the exception of we looked at the mid to late portions of March. And winter wheat should be in relatively good shape if we get a little more moisture going. And it's generally perceived that winter wheat already is somewhat better, maybe not necessarily in all the categories that we monitored with, but somewhat better than we had it, let's say, going into the winter season and last fall in the planting process and the germination process there on the Plain States. Anyway, back into late April, early to mid-May. Kind of okay, nothing to write home about. No big headlines. We continue to see a winding down, a weakening of El Nino. So we just are going to basically ignore El Nino in the way at least we put the forecast together and based it on some other data points and methodologies. And this is what we come up with. Maybe some good news for the central winter wheat belt, the southwestern and westernmost areas of the Corn Belt. A little better than we'd like to see down through the Delta and southeastern states. But, after we get past maybe usually mid-May into central and southern plains, that climate is more Mediterranean based, as in you got to bubble up these all or nothing thunderstorms or get a tropical system in there. Otherwise, you typically don't get many organized systems into the plain states. Also, relatively good news, a little subtle dip in the jet, back to dry time and a drier weather pattern over much of the northern and eastern Great Lakes region and Corn Belt locales. Mid-May to early June, as we wind out of meteorological spring and into early summer. Yeah, okay. No, maybe a little colder than we'd like to see. That source region is still dominant, where the snow cover is more dominant. And just the data points, the various indices that we take a look in the North Atlantic and the stratosphere would suggest we have these cold bubble highs here, but that's not unusual, climatologically speaking, for this part of the Canadian prairie. So temperatures about normal, growth rates, germination, opportunities for planting, so forth and so on, look to be pretty much on target. You usually get the warm ridge develop over the southwestern part of the country again. So here we go with, again, opportunities for planting over a good part of the Corn Belt. Maybe not necessarily good news. Back into the drier mode we go in the southwest and central and southern plains, but just the whole climatology and the short range of it all continues to point towards that. So, winter wheat ought to continue to move along. No big issues with regard to livestock operations. We continue, we think, on what should be a pretty normalized planting season based on the 5-year averages for the Corn Belt. One, wetter pattern, one wetter scenario, or two sections of the country into the far eastern Corn Belt. So, average or normal or typical, or however you want to slice, however you define normal, based on your local climate and planting operations. That's pretty much the story across the Corn Belt locales. Very little change in the thinking for summertime around here. Not much new information to go on. We're back at, we think, by at least into July and August, a neutral state atmosphere. That means pretty much water temperatures close to average in the Pacific. We do see a La Nina late this summer and into the fall season. We'll touch on that here in the broadcast to come. So a little sliver of cool air, a little dip in the jet across the northern and central parts of the U.S. This is climatologically speaking. If you're open a textbook and say, hey, what's the upper air pattern look like for summertime? That's what you're going to look like. That's what it's going to look like in the textbook. And so we have that scenario, and one that has boundaries that move on through. They get washed out. They try to come back as a warm front. They get washed through the area. So a propensity for maybe somewhat wetter than usual conditions. Nothing, I think, that degrades crop quality or field conditions, and matter of fact, probably some additional drought relief for that matter in the southwestern Corn Belt, central plains. A little wetter tendency in the Ohio Valley, far eastern Corn Belt. I don't think it's anything to make headlines there. So, Sarah, that's pretty much the story around here in the coming days, weeks, and months. Any questions? And I don't think we have anything out of the box down there, do we?
No, but feel free to post your questions if you have some, or let us know what it looks
for the
like.
phone ringing too, by the way.
Well, that was the person calling that was upset that it was going to get cold again. That was essentially me calling you. No, I'm kidding. So, you talk about, we're in really good shape. Of course, we got, some good precipitation. There's some dryness in certain areas. And it sounds almost like we might be having a earlier than normal planting season. And if that's the case, then it looks like a normal growing season. So we could have a really good crop year, in general. I know that's going out on a limb right now, but would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. It's at least for each and every year that I do this, you just can't use this broad brush approach to things we did 20 or 30 years ago. So there's little microclimates and issues, and I always run into people, fairs and speaking thing. Hey, you said this, but I really had that, and you're going to have those outlier points. But as a whole, I think a typical, normal, non-headline making planting season, relatively good growth and development, easy on the growing degree day units. I think the thing that needs to be watched out for would be dryness issues to start the growing season into those northern plains and areas of the northern Corn Belt locales. If we can move out of El Nino into a La Nina, there may be time to get some adequate moisture there into the northern sections of the Corn Belt. But apart from that, I think there's really no big headlines to speak of, at least from this vantage point in mid-March.
We do have a question that came in. What about drought in the Dakotas? Are you
Well,
you
yeah,
seeing anything there?
it's going to take a little while. I think we do have at least no better than spring typical normal rains. There's virtually no snow cover. It's a good thing with the Red River Valley of the North, because that's a usual flood problem every year, even in a normal year. Don't think it's going to happen this year. So I think we have a ways to go. I think that may be something where we're going to have to get into probably the early stages of planning to see a return to more frequent normalized moisture. And in the shorter term, there's still cold, there's still some snow, but it's probably the start of the planting season where we get into a little more normalized moisture pattern there. Probably a tendency, as we talked about, a break in that, and then it may be into the mid to late springtime where moisture comes back in. So not throwing in the towel. It may be a challenge to start, but I think as you get deeper into the springtime season, early summer, that moisture pattern will be general improving, maybe not moving out of the drought category, but general improvement to kind of keep things moving along.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned it, but let's hope there's no more of those fires down in Texas. That was just a
Yeah,
terrible thing to
that was just
see.
one.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
that is just, when you get relative humidities of 1 and 2%, and it's 90 degrees and it's a 40-mile-an-hour wind, and you're already in a drought. And just the slightest of anything. A lot of times it's lightning that gets that stuff going. So again, some optimism, at least kind of, as we say, settle the dust down there. But as overall, probably ending of the drought, just don't see it. But there should be modest improvements here in the weeks to come.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for your forecast and your outlook. And as Greg says, don't be fooled. Winter's not over yet, at least here in the Midwest.
Yes. My ears are going to be burning already, I'm sure, when we get done here.
Oh, thanks so much. Likewise, we thank all of you for joining in and tuning in with us. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 segments are available on feedstuffs.com. Until next time, and we'll have Greg back next month to give us another update. Until next time, thank you. For Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.